In this video, I'm going to explore classical conditioning. In many ways, classical conditioning is the most basic and automatic of the ways in which we learn. At its core, classical conditioning is an associative learning style, where we associate a neutral stimulus with an instinct or reflex. The first person to discover classical conditioning was a man named Ivan Pavlov back in the early 20th century. Pavlov was actually a physician, not a psychologist, and he's best known for conducting a series of experiments working on dogs. The purpose of Pavlov's experiments was to investigate what role salivation, or the production of saliva or spit, plays in our ability to digest food. If you watch my general overview video on learning, you'll remember that I talked about the difference between instincts and reflexes. A dog's ability to produce saliva in response to food, or a human's ability to do that for that matter, is a great example of a reflex. I mean, I'm pretty hungry right now, and if someone put a pizza in front of me, I'm definitely going to produce some saliva. My mom didn't teach me how to do that, it's just part of being a human being. The way that Pavlov decided to study how salivation works was by measuring the amount of saliva that dogs produced before, during, and after eating. So he took a group of dogs and he devised a contraption to literally measure the amount of saliva they produced. Now, through the course of this study, prior to the dogs being fed, a bell would be rung, and originally this bell was just something that was kind of benign. Basically, it was sort of like a way to let everyone know that they were about to feed the dogs. Try to think of the old Western movies where they would ring a bell and start yelling, "Y'all come and get it, food's up." Since they were measuring the amount of saliva produced by the dogs, they noticed over the course of the study, though, that the dogs started to salivate over the sound of the bell ringing alone, even if there was no food present. Now that may sound like a small feat, but essentially what they did was taught the dogs to have a reflex on command. After all, wouldn't it be difficult to get you to salivate over the sound of a bell? When it comes to classical conditioning, there's a lot of terms that we talk about that are very specific. If you watch my general learning video, you know that I talked about how when we say conditioning, you should really think of it as being synonymous with learning. That's going to help you out a lot with remembering these terms because they tend to confuse a lot of people. The terms you need to know for classical conditioning are neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So again, if you think of unconditioned and conditioned as being unlearned and learned, it's going to help you better understand what these terms mean. Basically, an unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response. In this case, unconditioned means unlearned, meaning something you do that you didn't have to learn, like an instinct or a reflex. In Pavlov's experiment, the dog salivating would be the unconditioned response. It's a response to the food, and in this case, the food would be the unconditioned stimulus. The bell ringing early in the experiment would be a neutral stimulus because it didn't cause any type of reaction in the dogs. A neutral stimulus is anything that we don't already have a response for. It's just something that's neutral, that doesn't elicit any kind of reaction. Now in the experiment, even though it was totally by accident, the dogs, through a period of acquisition or learning, paired the sound of the bell with the food and ended up developing a response to that bell. Once that happened, you can't say the bell is a neutral stimulus anymore because you do now have a response for it. So what ended up happening was that the bell, through this period of acquisition, ended up becoming a conditioned stimulus or a learned stimulus. The dog salivating over the sound of the bell became a conditioned or learned response. And this is where it's going to really come in helpful for you to remember that conditioned means learned. If you think of it in terms of conditioned response as something you had to learn through acquisition, it's going to help you better understand those terms and be able to apply them. So using these terms, we can think of classical conditioning as being a process of acquisition where an unconditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus, and over a period of time an association is made to the point that the unconditioned response to the unconditioned stimulus now gets paired with the neutral stimulus. Once that association is made, and happens even when the unconditioned stimulus is no longer present, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response becomes a conditioned response. Let me give you another example, and I'm going to stick with dogs just because that's something that's easy for all of us to relate to. So I have a little beagle named Sammy. Sammy is a very smart dog, and he's very food motivated. Pretty early on when I got Sammy, he started to learn that the sound of a plastic bag opening meant that he was going to get a treat because most of the treats I gave him were in plastic bags. Now what's interesting with Sammy is that it didn't take him long to learn this, and it's through classical conditioning. Because while him running into the kitchen over the smell of food is not something he had to learn, it would be an instinct or a reflex, having that reaction over the sound of plastic definitely is something he had to learn. What's interesting with Sammy is him learning to respond to the sound of plastic bag opening and associating that with getting food is what we would call first order or simple conditioning. This is what happened with Pavlov's dogs. But once the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus and causes a conditioned response, you can pair it with another neutral stimulus, and when we do that, we call it second order or higher order conditioning. Sammy did this too, because he pretty quickly started to associate getting a treat not just with the sound of a plastic bag opening, but also the sound of the cabinet door opening where I kept that plastic bag. So this is where he paired another neutral stimulus, the sound of the cabinet door opening, with the conditioned stimulus, the sound of the plastic bag. This would be an example of second order conditioning. There are two more terms you need to know when it comes to classical conditioning: stimulus discrimination and stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination is something that Sammy actually demonstrated when he learned what cabinet door his treats were held in. Stimulus discrimination happens when you can distinguish a difference between very similar stimuli and only have a response to that one specific stimuli. So to me, there's no difference in the sound of any of the cabinets opening in my kitchen. But to Sammy, he knows exactly the sound of that one cabinet door opening and has associated it with him getting a treat. Now, if I open that one specific cabinet door, without fail, I can look down and I can see him staring back up at me. If I open any other cabinet door in my kitchen, he'll still be fast asleep on the couch. Even though they sound identical to me, he can discriminate between them. Stimulus generalization is the opposite of this. It is where you have a response to similar stimuli. And I'll give you some examples of that here in a little bit. Now, usually at this point, when I'm explaining classical conditioning, a lot of people start wondering why I'm talking so much about dogs. After all, with psychology, we're talking about humans. We're talking about people psychology, not animal psychology. Well, it's easy to explain these phenomena by talking about dogs, and I always like to say that people like to think that we're quite different from animals, but the truth is we do have more in common than we'd probably like to admit. This process of classical conditioning, even though it was discovered by Ivan Pavlov, was actually applied to people by a psychologist named James Watson. James Watson is perhaps best known for an experiment that he did on a young child called the Little Albert experiment. In this experiment, Watson, through classical conditioning, was able to give a young child a phobia. A phobia is a psychological disorder that involves an intense fear of some kind of object or event. So let me explain how this happened. James Watson would show little Albert a white rat. It's worth noting that sometimes we have aversions or dislikings of certain objects, and sometimes that's culturally influenced. Young children don't necessarily have a fear of rats or bugs like the average adult may have. So to little Albert, the white rat was a neutral stimulus. However, all humans have a reflex of being startled over loud noises. This reflex is especially strong in babies and toddlers. So when James Watson showed little Albert the rat, he would make a loud noise and Albert would be startled and started to cry. Over a period of acquisition, little Albert started to associate the white rat, which was a neutral stimulus, with the loud noise, which was the unconditioned stimulus, and would cause him to be afraid and cry, which is the unconditioned response. This happened until little Albert would freak out just over seeing the white rat. The white rat had become a conditioned stimulus. Albert also experienced stimulus generalization because he had the same exact reaction that he had with the white rat to other things that just happened to have white fur. He would freak out over seeing a white rabbit, a white teddy bear, even cotton. There's even an infamous photo of John Watson wearing a Santa beard and lying next to Albert with him crying, and the caption reads, "Now he fears even Santa Claus." This is one of the reasons why I think of Watson as being kind of like the douchebag of early psychology. However, he did show that phobias can be learned. This is especially important to me because it reminds me of a story that happened when I was a kid. I was a young boy, only about 7 years old, when I was walking in my backyard. I thought I stepped on a garden hose, but it wasn't a garden hose. It was actually a snake, and I started to freak out. It started to coil itself around my foot, and it even bit me. I yelled and screamed and went running back inside my house, dragging my foot across the carpet. I was freaking out, and my little 7-year-old brain, I thought that I was dying. I also think my mom probably thought that too because she was freaking out, hearing me scream and yell and watching me drag my foot across the floor of my house. In that split second of me stepping on the snake and being bitten, I went through a period of acquisition. That's the important thing to remember about acquisition. It doesn't have to take days, weeks, months, or years. It can happen almost instantaneously. For me, it happened almost instantaneously, and in that split second, I started to associate snakes, which were largely a neutral stimulus, with this pain and fear that I was experiencing. I ended up developing a phobia of snakes. I also had stimulus generalization because it wasn't just snakes themselves, it was anything that reminded me of a snake. It was garden hoses, pipes, similar shaped objects that were on the floor and resembled a snake would give me the exact same kind of reaction. Even if I walked out into the woods or into the park and I saw the roots of trees kind of like snaking through the ground, it would freak me out. Some people have this so bad, they won't even eat things like gummy worms or spaghetti. This type of stimulus generalization tends to be very common with people that have phobias. Now, classical conditioning is not the only way a person can develop a phobia. However, it does tend to be one of the most common ways. What's also interesting is that just how classical conditioning can lead a person to having something like a phobia, it can also be used to help treat people for phobias, as well as other types of psychological disorders. When we use classical conditioning as a treatment, we call it counterconditioning. And there's really two main ways in which this is done. The first is called aversive conditioning. With aversive conditioning, essentially what you're doing is trying to change a behavior by pairing that bad behavior with something that is unpleasant to the person. So one example that comes to my mind of this was something that a student of mine once told me, which was that when she was a young girl, she would bite her fingernails a lot. Her grandmother wanted her to break from this habit, so she would make her put her fingertips in chili peppers. Every time that she went to bite her fingernails, then she'd taste the chili and it'd be really unpleasant. Although I have to say to everybody that this tactic probably wouldn't have worked on me as a kid because I happen to love spicy food. The second type of counterconditioning is called systematic desensitization. Systematic desensitization was something that I used that helped me deal with the phobia of snakes that I mentioned earlier. It largely involves reversing the association made through classical conditioning. So usually with systematic desensitization, The first step is to get a person to learn how to deal with their fear and their anxiety. This may be something like breathing techniques that a person can use to help make them feel calmer. Using techniques like breathing, stress management techniques to calm yourself down, you're then exposed to the thing that elicits that fear response, and you're exposed to it in increasing doses. So for me as a young kid, maybe the first step after I learned how to deal with the fear is to imagine a snake. I would think of a snake and then deal with that fear response until just thinking of a snake no longer gave me that response. Once I was able to do that, I'm then able to go up a little bit more with exposing myself to snakes. So now maybe instead of thinking of a snake, I'll actually look at a picture of a snake. Same thing, I'll look at a picture of a snake, get a fear response, calm myself down, and keep doing this over and over until it no longer elicits that response. Then I'm going to go up to something a little bit more intense, like maybe now I'll actually walk in front of a snake at a pet store and keep going in this way until I no longer have the fear reaction of snakes at all. Both aversive conditioning and systematic desensitization are still used in psychology, but systematic desensitization is by far more common. If you're enjoying content like this, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and give me a like with the thumbs up icon below. This helps me to continue to expand these videos and provide amazing content to all my viewers. Thanks for watching, everybody.